Chapter 11, Conserving Biological Resources, Video 1. Biodiversity is, quote, the variety and variability among living organisms and the ecological complexes in which they occur, end quote. Conservation biology is a new subdiscipline of biology that draws from genetics, ecology, and many other fields to find practical ways of saving species. So how do we measure what's at risk? Biodiversity at its simplest most commonly measures species richness. Biodiversity varies wildly around the planet over time. About 1.8 million species have been described, and not all groups of organisms or parts of the world have been studied equally. The areas with the most species, the tropics, are actually the least known. When we lose biodiversity, we can lose it through extinction, in other words, the death of a group or a species of animals. Or we can lose it through impoverishment, which is more common than species extinction. Impoverishment can be comprised of extirpation, where a species has died out in a local area, or ecological extinction, a species is too rare to have any impact on its ecosystem anymore. An example is the Florida panther, which has a population of fewer than 80. There have been other major mass extinctions throughout history, as determined by the fossil record, and we may be in the midst of another one. Extinction rates of well-studied groups have been increasing rapidly. Many species now have so few individuals alive, they are probably doomed to extinction. Current extinction rates are hundreds of times higher than the quote-unquote normal average extinction rate. It's hard to comprehend how bad the current rate of species extinctions around the world has become without knowing what it was before people came along. The newest estimate is that the pre-human rate was 10 times lower than scientists had thought, which means the current level is 10 times worse. Extinctions are about 1,000 times more frequent now than in the 60 million years before people came along. One paper calculates that a normal background rate of extinction of 0.1 extinctions per million species per year. By contrast, the current extinction rate is more in the order of 100 extinctions per million species per year. There is little doubt among the scientists that humans are not merely witness to the current elevation extinction rates, but are part of the cause. This table shows This table shows estimated species in different areas from different projections. So what causes all this biodiversity loss? Well, extinction primarily is caused by environmental change. Species usually can adapt if change is not too rapid. But when change is rapid, like the ones caused by human population growth, then they are too massive and fast to adapt to. Four ways that humans cause population decline and species extinction include habitat destruction, like draining swamps, building dams, toxic pollution, changes to the biological environment, like the introduction of new species, a new predator, or something that changes the landscape, overhunting, and secondary extinctions. Secondary extinctions is an interesting concept that most people are not that familiar with. Once a species goes extinct, there will likely be other extinctions or even an avalanche of them. Some cases of these quote-unquote secondary extinctions are simple to understand. For example, for every bird or mammal that goes extinct, one of several species of parasite will also likely disappear. From well-studied species, it is known that bird and mammal species tend to have parasites on them and inside them that can live on no other host. Other extinctions cause changes that can be quite complicated. Species are bound together in ecological communities and form food webs of species interactions. Once a species is lost, those species that fed on it, were fed on by it, or were otherwise benefited or harmed by that species will be affected, for better or worse. These species will in turn affect other species. Ecological theory suggests the patterns of secondary extinction are quite complicated and thus may be difficult to demonstrate. Globally, causes for deforestation are primarily logging, small-scale or subsistence agriculture, and large-scale agriculture and pasture land. The mix of these three causes changes depending on what area of the tropics you're in. If you can see from these estimations, these lands are vanishing rapidly. Habitat fragmentation describes the emergence of discontinuities or fragmentation in an organism's preferred environment or habitat, which causes population fragmentation. Habitat fragmentation can be caused by geological processes that slowly alter the layout of the physical environment, which is also, if you remember, is suspected of being one of the major causes of speciation, or by human activity such as land conversion, which can alter the environment much faster and causes extinctions of many species. The size of the fragment will influence the number of species which are present when the fragment was initially created, and will influence the ability of these species to persist in the fragment. Small fragments of habitat can only support small populations of plants and animals, and small populations are more vulnerable to extinction. Minor fluctuations in climate, resources, or other factors that would be unremarkable and quickly corrected in large populations can be catastrophic in small isolated populations. Thus, fragmentation of habitat is an important cause of species extinction. Additionally, habitat fragmentation leads to edge effects. The edges of habitats are important parts of the landscape and are so unique that they have their own sets of physical conditions and communities of organisms. When habitats become fragmented, their edges often become more abrupt and transition less smoothly than they would naturally. Edges also usually have less diversity and are dominated by a small number of species specially adapted to those areas. When more edges are created, the species inhabiting the edges expand into areas that they normally wouldn't be found. This creates new competition for species native to the fragmented habitats, and this can have detrimental effects on those original species. Another factor is introduced species. Some exotic species can reap devastation on natural ecosystems. Once the species are introduced, it's hard to get rid of them. Examples of introduced species in Maine include green clams, Eurasian green crabs that affect the habitat for saltwater clams, Eurasian milfoil, which rapidly changes freshwater lakes, and the emerald ash borer, which is newly discovered in Maine forests and a direct threat to the forests of Maine. With the ash borer, the larvae feed on the inner bark of ash trees, disrupting the tree's ability to transport water and nutrients. The emerald ash borer probably arrived in the United States on solid wood packing material carried in cargo ships or airplanes, originating in native Asia. The introduction of exotic species is increasingly due to the increased movement of people. And here you have the example of the zebra mussel in the Great Lakes, which is so successful that it's actually clogging the plumbing and clarifying the lakes of algae, which the fish feed on. Another example of an invasive species is the old world climbing fern, native to East Asia and Australia before it was introduced to the US intentionally as a landscape ornamental plant. The old world climbing fern is an aggressive, non-native invasive plant that grows in moist habitats in South Florida. First thought to be established around 1965, and now infests more than 200,000 acres. The fern grows fronds up to 125 feet long It spreads easily, grows quickly, suffocates native habitats, and carries hot fire into treetops and wetlands where fire doesn't belong. The old work climbing fir smothers everything in its path, even pine, oak, and cypress trees, and rare plants such as the celestial lily, heartwrightthia, and Florida willow. It destroys habitat for many animals in the process, including Florida black bear, the endangered wood stork, and Sherman's fox squirrel. Overhunting is another important mode of extinction. People have been overhunting for millennia. Large animals and plants are often overhunted or consumed more than small organisms. When a population becomes too small, the species will fall into an extinction vortex. Small populations may have breeding problems, and smaller populations can contribute to what we call genetic bottlenecks or population bottlenecks. A population bottleneck is a sharp reduction in the size of a population due to environmental effects such as earthquakes, floods, fires, or droughts, or human activity. Such events can reduce the variation in the gene pool of a population. After an event, a smaller population of animals with a correspondingly smaller genetic diversity remains to pass on genes to the future generations of offspring. In consequence of such population size reductions and loss of genetic variation, the robustness of the population is reduced. The ability of the population to survive, selecting environmental changes and climatic change, or a shift in available resources is also reduced. The concept of a minimal viable population, or MVP, is the smallest population size needed to stay above the extinction vortex, the so-called extinction vortex, and avoid genetic bottleneck. Another thing that can add to lowered biodiversity is community degradation. Communities and ecosystems are more likely to be disrupted and degraded by human activity than completely destroyed. Ecosystem simplification occurs when the number of species in the ecosystem declines, which can disrupt the makeup and infrastructure of the community. Lower diversity leads to easier disruption. Ecosystem health can be defined by indicator species in these areas and in these areas and other in other areas. In review for this section, we want to know how we measure biodiversity and risk. What is the biological impoverishment and loss? Extinction rates. What are some of the causes? What are secondary extinctions? What is habitat fragmentation and edge effect? Can you give some examples of introduced species in Maine? What is the minimum viable population? Also, what are genetic bottlenecks?